It's time to settle in and grab a tissue because we have an emotional roller coaster of a story for you today on AGS Stories. When it comes to family, the bonds we share can be both unbreakable and incredibly fragile. Nothing cuts deeper than the words or actions of a parent toward their child, or vice versa. Today, we're diving into a story of pain, estrangement, and the courage it takes to confront a complicated family history. What would you do if your father, who abandoned you as a child and blamed you for your mother's death, suddenly wanted to reconnect, not for you, but for his new wife? Family can hurt us in ways no one else ever could, but it's the way we choose to respond that defines the story we write for ourselves. Hi everyone, and welcome back to AGS Stories. Before we dive in, I just want to warn you, this story is bound to pull on your heartstrings and might even make you angry. It comes from the subreddit Am I the A-hole? And the moral dilemmas and raw emotions here are something you won't want to miss. So, let's get started. This story comes from a 29-year-old man named Caleb. Caleb's life has been anything but ordinary, and honestly, it's heartbreaking. From the moment he was born, tragedy cast a shadow over his life. His mother, Grace, passed away during childbirth. Instead of receiving the unconditional love a newborn deserves, Caleb was met with something unimaginable: blame. His father, David, held Caleb responsible for Grace's death, and that resentment would define their relationship, or lack thereof, for years to come. Caleb's childhood was riddled with emotional neglect. David couldn't look at him without voicing his anger, often saying that Caleb was the reason his wife was gone. Family events were painful as David openly ignored Caleb, refusing to acknowledge his existence. By the time Caleb was old enough to understand, David's words had already done irreversible damage. Therapy became Caleb's lifeline, but even as he worked through his trauma, he couldn't shake the guilt David had instilled in him. The breaking point came after Caleb graduated from high school. David coldly told him he no longer had any legal obligation to support him and to never contact him again. From that moment, Caleb accepted that his father didn't want him in his life. He moved on, finding solace and stability with his aunt Caroline, who had taken him in and raised him like her own son. Fast forward to the present, and out of nowhere, David is trying to reconnect with Caleb. The reason? David's new wife, Jennifer, wants to meet him. According to David, she believes their estrangement was simply due to life getting in the way. But Caleb knows the truth. It was never just life. It was years of rejection, hurtful words, and emotional scars. David has asked Caleb to keep the past quiet, hoping for a fresh start for Jennifer's sake. Caleb's dilemma? Should he go along with the lie or reveal the truth about why their relationship is so broken? Buckle up. This story is just getting started. Caleb took a deep breath as he sat down to write about his life. It wasn't easy revisiting the past, but he needed clarity, perhaps some guidance. His story was messy, filled with grief, rejection, and years of trying to heal from wounds inflicted by the very person who was supposed to protect him. Caleb's life began in tragedy. His mother, Grace, passed away during childbirth, leaving his father, David, utterly broken. But instead of mourning as a family, David turned his grief into anger, directing it at the person least deserving of it: Caleb. From the time Caleb could understand words, David's cruelty was evident. He didn't hesitate to remind Caleb that his birth had taken Grace from him. "If you weren't born, she'd still be here," David would say, his voice dripping with disdain. As a child, Caleb didn't understand why his father was so cold. He craved affection, the kind he saw other kids receive from their parents. But family events only solidified his reality. While other fathers proudly introduced their sons, David treated Caleb like an afterthought, or worse, like a burden. Caleb would stand in the corner, watching David laugh and converse with relatives, pretending Caleb didn't exist. By the time Caleb was 8, he'd stopped trying to sit next to his father at the dinner table. He learned to keep his distance, silently wishing for a kind word or a rare smile. But those moments never came. Instead, David's resentment grew more vocal. "You killed her, Caleb," he once shouted after a particularly bad day. Caleb had been playing with his toys in the living room, oblivious to his father's simmering rage. The words cut deep, sticking to him like a scar that no amount of time could erase. Caleb's saving grace was his aunt, Caroline, Grace's younger sister. Caroline was everything David wasn't: loving, kind, and fiercely protective. When David's neglect became impossible to ignore, Caroline stepped in. She took Caleb into her home, becoming the mother figure he desperately needed. It was Caroline who hugged him when he cried, who reassured him that his mother would have loved him, and who quietly took him to therapy when the nightmares started. Therapy became a lifeline for Caleb. By the time he was 10, he was sitting in a softly lit office, pouring his heart out to a therapist named Dr. Wells. He talked about his father's words, his loneliness, and the unbearable guilt that weighed on him. "Am I going to hell for killing my mom?" he once asked, his small voice trembling. Dr. Wells looked at him with compassionate eyes and assured him he wasn't responsible. But knowing that logically and believing it emotionally were two different battles. For years, Caleb worked on healing. He focused on school, sports, and building a life that didn't revolve around his father's rejection. Caroline was his anchor, attending every school event and cheering him on from the sidelines. When Caleb graduated high school, she was the one beaming with pride in the audience, while David was conspicuously absent. The day of Caleb's high school graduation was bittersweet. He'd hoped, foolishly, that David might show up, even just out of obligation. But instead, Caleb received a text message. It was short and cold. "I have no legal obligation to you anymore. Don't bother contacting me again." Caleb stared at his phone, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes. That was the moment he realized there was no saving their relationship. David didn't just dislike him, he wanted nothing to do with him. Over the next decade, Caleb built a life for himself. He graduated college, found a stable job, and started dating his girlfriend, Melissa. He worked hard to create the kind of life he'd always dreamed of, one filled with love and support. But even as he moved forward, the pain of his father's rejection lingered in the background, a ghost he couldn't fully escape. That's why the phone call from David caught him off guard. It had been nearly 10 years since they'd spoken, and Caleb had assumed they never would again. But there was David's name on his phone screen, the number he'd memorized as a child but hadn't dialed in years. "Caleb, it's me," David said when Caleb reluctantly answered. His voice was cautious, almost unsure. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Caleb stayed silent, his heart pounding in his chest. David's tone wasn't angry or resentful. It was almost nervous. That alone was enough to throw Caleb off balance. "Jennifer, my wife, she wants to meet you," David continued. "She thinks it's important for us to have a relationship." The words hung in the air like a bad joke. A relationship? After all these years? Caleb clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Why now?" he asked, his voice cold. David hesitated. "She doesn't know. Everything. She thinks we lost touch because of life, college, distance, stuff like that." His voice grew softer. "She's been asking me to reach out, and I thought maybe this could be a fresh start." Caleb felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. A fresh start? After years of being told he was unwanted? And now David wanted to rewrite history, painting their estrangement as nothing more than a misunderstanding? It was almost laughable. "Does she know why we're really estranged?" Caleb asked pointedly. "No," David admitted quickly, "and I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell her. She doesn't need to know all that stuff." All that stuff. That's how David referred to years of emotional abuse and abandonment. It took everything in Caleb not to yell. Instead, he took a deep breath and forced himself to stay calm. "I'll think about it," he said flatly before ending the call. For the next few days, Caleb wrestled with his decision. Part of him wanted to meet Jennifer, if only to satisfy his curiosity. What kind of person marries a man like David? But the other part of him, the part still carrying the scars of David's cruelty, wanted nothing to do with it. The idea of sitting across from David and pretending their history didn't exist felt impossible. Caleb talked it over with Caroline and Melissa, both of whom urged him to prioritize his own well-being. Caroline reminded him that he didn't owe David anything, while Melissa worried about how reopening old wounds might affect his mental health. "You've come so far, Caleb," she said, holding his hand. "Don't let him pull you back." But despite their warnings, Caleb couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed to confront this situation head-on. If he didn't, it would haunt him. He wasn't sure what he'd say or how things would go, but one thing was certain: He wasn't going to let David control the narrative. Jennifer deserved to know the truth, and Caleb deserved to speak it. As he prepared for the meeting, Caleb felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and even a hint of hope. Not hope for reconciliation, but hope for closure. Whatever happened, he knew this was his chance to finally take control of his story, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Caleb's story struck a chord with the Reddit community, sparking a flood of reactions, advice, and emotional responses. As he sat reading through the comments, he was overwhelmed by the support and validation from strangers who saw the pain he had endured and the courage it took to face his past. Many commenters applauded Caleb for standing up for himself and sharing the truth about his father's behavior with Jennifer. They pointed out that David's attempt to rewrite history was not only dishonest, but selfish. The top comment, from user TruthSleuth92, said, "Your dad is a grade A jerk, and his wife deserves to know the truth. If he truly wanted to make amends, he would have apologized for everything he did instead of asking you to lie for him. You did the right thing by being honest." She needed to see the man she married for who he really is. This comment received thousands of upvotes, with other users replying to express their agreement. For many, it was clear that David's lack of accountability was the root of the problem, and Caleb had no obligation to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Another user, MamaBear2000, offered heartfelt encouragement, saying, "Caleb, you are so strong for telling the truth, even when it wasn't easy. You saved Jennifer from being married to someone who abandoned his own child and refused to take responsibility for his actions. That's not love. That's selfishness. I'm so sorry you had to endure this, but I hope you know you're not alone. You have people who care about you and want to see you thrive." Comments like this reminded Caleb of the importance of speaking his truth, even if it caused discomfort or fallout. He felt seen in a way he hadn't expected, as if the community understood his pain and stood beside him in solidarity. However, not all the responses were entirely supportive. A few commenters raised concerns about how the truth might affect Jennifer, and whether Caleb's decision to reveal everything was the best course of action. User Diplomatic Dude 7 shared a more measured perspective. "I get why you told her the truth, but part of me wonders if it could have been handled differently. Maybe a softer approach, like letting your dad explain himself while you added your perspective, would have been less damaging. That said, your dad created this situation by lying in the first place. He shouldn't have asked you to carry that burden." This comment sparked a thoughtful discussion about whether honesty should always come first, even when it risks causing pain. While some users agreed with a softer approach, many argued that Caleb's father had forfeited the right to dictate how the truth was shared when he abandoned Caleb in the first place. Another theme in the comments was the validation of Caleb's feelings. People reassured him that his emotions were valid and that he didn't owe his father anything. User Scarred But Healing wrote, "As someone who also grew up with a parent who blamed me for things beyond my control, I just want to say, I see you, Caleb. What your dad did was cruel, and you deserved so much better. Don't let anyone guilt you into thinking you were wrong for telling the truth. This was never your mess to clean up, and it's okay to prioritize your own healing." Caleb couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort reading through the comments. For so long, he had carried the weight of his father's rejection and abuse, but seeing people validate his experience made him realize he wasn't alone. He also appreciated the differing perspectives. It gave him a lot to think about as he processed the events that had unfolded. The discussion on Reddit wasn't just about Caleb's actions. It became a larger conversation about accountability, family dynamics, and the power of truth. Caleb felt a small sense of relief knowing that his story had resonated with so many, and that for once he didn't have to carry the burden of his father's mistakes alone. As he closed the thread for the night, he found himself reflecting on what the next steps in his journey might look like, and how he could continue moving forward. Caleb didn't have to wait long for the fallout. The truth, once spoken, rippled through his father's life like a tidal wave. Jennifer, David's wife, had been visibly shaken when Caleb revealed the real reason behind their estrangement. Her polite smile had faded as Caleb recounted years of verbal abuse and neglect. Every cruel word David had ever spoken, every moment of abandonment, hung heavy in the room. By the time Caleb finished, Jennifer sat frozen, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. David, on the other hand, looked furious. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "This wasn't necessary," he hissed through gritted teeth, glaring at Caleb. But Caleb didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he felt unburdened. He had carried the weight of his father's actions for far too long, and finally it was out in the open. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jennifer stood abruptly, her voice trembling as she excused herself to get some air. Caleb took that as his cue to leave, offering no goodbyes to his father. As he walked out the door, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and guilt swirling together in a chaotic storm. He had spoken his truth, but at what cost? A few days later, Caleb's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. It was Jennifer. Her voice was shaky, as if she'd been crying. "Caleb," she began, "I just wanted to thank you for being honest with me. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you." Caleb was silent, unsure of what to say. Jennifer continued, her tone growing steadier. "I had no idea about any of it. You told me you two lost touch because of life, but the things you shared—" She paused, taking a deep breath. "It's disgusting. I'm so sorry you went through that." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. Hearing her acknowledge his pain was both validating and heartbreaking. "I didn't tell you to hurt you," he said quietly. "I just couldn't sit there and let him pretend it was something it wasn't." "I know," Jennifer replied, "and I'm glad you did. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night. I don't think I can stay with someone who treated his own son like that." Her words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He hadn't intended to destroy their marriage, but it seemed inevitable now. Jennifer went on to explain that she had confronted David about Caleb's revelations. At first, he denied the extent of it, downplaying his actions as mistakes made in grief. But as Jennifer pressed, his defenses crumbled. He admitted to the cruelty, the abandonment, and the hatred he had harbored for years. "I can't look at him the same way," Jennifer confessed. "If he could do that to his own child, what kind of man is he?" After the call ended, Caleb sat in silence, grappling with his emotions. He felt a sense of relief knowing that Jennifer now understood the truth, but the guilt was hard to ignore. He had exposed his father for who he truly was, and now, David's marriage was hanging by a thread. Was it his place to interfere? Could he have handled it differently? These questions haunted Caleb as he lay awake at night. He replayed the conversation with Jennifer in his head, wondering if he had been too harsh, or if there had been a way to soften the blow. But every time he doubted himself, he thought back to his childhood, to the nights he cried himself to sleep, the cruel words that echoed in his mind, and the hollow ache of being unwanted. David had created this situation, not him. Caleb had simply refused to keep silent about it. Still, the moral dilemma lingered. Caleb turned to the Reddit community once again, updating them on what had happened and seeking their thoughts. "Was I wrong to tell her the truth?" he wrote. "I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't just sit there and let him lie. Now she's considering leaving him, and I can't help but feel like I ruined their marriage. Did I go too far?" The comments flooded in, a mix of support and nuanced perspectives. Some reassured Caleb that he had done the right thing, emphasizing that the truth was necessary for Jennifer to make an informed decision about her future. Others acknowledged the complexity of the situation, suggesting that while honesty was important, the fallout was bound to be messy. "You didn't ruin their marriage," one commenter wrote. "Your dad did that by lying and treating you the way he did. Jennifer deserved to know who she married." Caleb appreciated the validation, but couldn't shake the weight on his shoulders. He spent hours talking to Caroline and Melissa, both of whom reminded him that he wasn't responsible for David's actions. "You told the truth," Caroline said firmly, "and sometimes the truth is hard to hear. But that doesn't make it wrong." Even with their support, Caleb struggled to find peace. He knew he had opened Pandora's box, and there was no closing it now. The question wasn't whether he could undo the damage, it was whether he could live with the consequences. Deep down, he knew he hadn't acted out of malice. He had simply refused to let his father rewrite history at his expense. But the guilt lingered, a shadow he couldn't fully escape. As the days passed, Caleb tried to focus on the positives. He had spoken his truth, something he never thought he'd have the courage to do. Jennifer had shown him compassion and understanding, validating the pain he had carried for so long. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt a sense of closure. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was done carrying the burden of his father's mistakes. It was time to move forward, one step at a time. After Caleb updated the Reddit community on the aftermath of his conversation with Jennifer, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life weighed in, offering him support, advice, and words of encouragement. Caleb scrolled through the comments, grateful for the perspectives of strangers who seemed to truly understand the complexity of his situation. The overwhelming sentiment was one of reassurance. Caleb had done the right thing. Many commenters emphasized that David's marriage was built on lies, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. User Real Talk Rebecca wrote, "Caleb, you are not responsible for your father's broken marriage. He broke it the moment he decided to lie to Jennifer about the kind of man he is. She had every right to know the truth, and you gave her that. Don't let guilt consume you. You didn't ruin anything. Your dad's actions did." This comment resonated deeply with Caleb. It echoed his own inner conflict, wanting to be honest while struggling with the unintended consequences of that honesty. Rebecca's words reminded him that David had created this situation, not him. Other commenters took a more personal approach, sharing their own experiences with toxic family dynamics and how they found peace. User Healing Heart 28 wrote, "Caleb, your story hits so close to home. I grew up with a parent who constantly made me feel like I was the problem. It wasn't until years later that I realized their behavior wasn't my fault. What you did took so much courage. Jennifer needed to know the truth so she could make an informed decision. And you needed to let go of the burden you've been carrying. Closure is so important, and I'm proud of you for finding it." Caleb found himself reading this comment several times, feeling an odd sense of comfort. Knowing that others had been through similar experiences made him feel less alone. He realized that sharing his story wasn't just cathartic for him, it was also helping others reflect on their own struggles and find strength. As Caleb reflected on the comments, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief. The guilt still lingered, but the validation and empathy he received reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey. The community's support made it clear that his actions, though painful, were necessary for everyone involved. He began to focus on what lay ahead, determined to build a life free from the shadows of his past. Caleb had thought the hardest part of this ordeal was over, but the days that followed were anything but easy. The truth he revealed had set off a chain reaction that seemed impossible to contain. He knew the fallout would be significant, but he hadn't anticipated just how deeply it would impact everyone involved. The call came late one evening, just as Caleb was settling in after work. It was Jennifer. Her voice was quieter than before, tinged with exhaustion but also resolution. "Caleb," she said, "I wanted you to know I've decided to leave him. I've moved out." Caleb was stunned, even though part of him had expected this outcome. Jennifer explained how, after their initial conversation, she had confronted David again. She demanded full transparency, and he reluctantly admitted to everything: his hatred toward Caleb, his emotional neglect, and even his attempts to rewrite history for her sake. "He tried to justify it," Jennifer said, her voice trembling. "He told me he was grieving and didn't know how to cope. But grief doesn't excuse cruelty, Caleb. It doesn't excuse what he did to you." Caleb listened in silence, a lump forming in his throat. Jennifer continued, "I realized I couldn't stay with someone like that. If he could treat his own child that way, what does that say about him? I deserve better. You deserved better." Hearing those words was bittersweet. Caleb felt a weight lift off his shoulders, knowing Jennifer had seen the truth, but guilt still lingered. "I didn't mean to ruin your marriage," he said softly. "You didn't ruin anything." Jennifer replied firmly, "David did that himself. You just gave me the clarity I needed to see it." After they ended the call, Caleb sat alone in his living room, grappling with the emotions swirling inside him. Relief, sadness, guilt, and even a strange sense of justice. It was all too much. He had spent so long carrying the weight of his father's actions, and now, for the first time, he felt like he could begin to let it go. A week later, David reached out. Caleb hesitated to respond, but something inside him told him he needed to hear what his father had to say. They met at a small park not far from Caleb's apartment. David looked older than Caleb remembered, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own decisions had finally caught up to him. The conversation started awkwardly, with David fumbling through small talk before finally addressing the elephant in the room. "Jennifer left me," he said, his voice hollow. "She told me what you said." Caleb nodded, saying nothing. He wasn't there to comfort his father. He was there for closure. David sighed heavily, staring at the ground. "I know I messed up," he admitted. "I blamed you for something that wasn't your fault. I was angry and broken after losing your mom, and I took it out on you. That was wrong." For a brief moment, Caleb felt a flicker of hope. Was this an apology? But then David continued. "That doesn't change how I feel, though. If you hadn't been born, she'd still be here. I know it's not fair, but it's how I feel, and I can't change that." Caleb felt his chest tighten. Even now, after everything, David couldn't fully let go of his resentment. But Caleb wasn't surprised. He had stopped expecting more from his father a long time ago. David looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this," he said. "I should have left you alone. That was selfish of me." Caleb nodded again, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. "I think we both know we're not going to have a relationship," he said quietly. David didn't argue. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." They parted ways with no handshake, no hug, just a mutual understanding that this chapter of their lives was over. As Caleb walked away, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. He had finally said goodbye to the man who had caused him so much pain, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the hold his father's actions had on him. Back home, Caleb found himself reflecting on the people who had been his real family all along. His aunt, Caroline, had stepped in when no one else would, giving him the love and support he needed to survive. She had been his rock, his parent in every way that mattered. Then there was Melissa, his girlfriend, who had stood by his side through this entire ordeal, reminding him that he was capable of love and deserving of happiness. And now, there was his soon-to-be-born son, the little boy who represented a fresh start and a chance to break the cycle of pain. Caleb vowed to be the kind of father he had never had, a father who loved unconditionally, who supported and protected his child no matter what. "It stops with me," he whispered to himself. "The neglect, the anger, the blame, it ends here." As the weeks passed, Caleb found himself healing in ways he hadn't thought possible. He still carried scars from his past, but they no longer defined him. He was building a life filled with love, hope, and resilience, surrounded by people who truly cared for him. In the end, Caleb realized that closure doesn't always come in the form of reconciliation. Sometimes, it's about letting go of what was and embracing what is. And as he looked toward the future, he knew one thing for certain. He was finally free. Caleb's story is one that stays with you long after you hear it. It's a story of pain, resilience, and ultimately, healing. As we wrap up, let's take a moment to reflect on some of the profound lessons his journey has taught us. First and foremost, Caleb's story reminds us of the power of truth. Speaking the truth can be incredibly difficult, especially when it risks upsetting the fragile balance of relationships. But Caleb's courage to confront the lies and share his experiences with Jennifer wasn't just an act of honesty, it was an act of liberation. It freed him from the weight of years of silence and allowed him to reclaim his story. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is often the first step toward closure and healing. Another powerful takeaway is the idea that family isn't always about biology. For Caleb, his real family wasn't defined by blood, but by love, care, and support. His Aunt Caroline stepped up when his father couldn't, becoming the parent he needed and deserved. His girlfriend, Melissa, stood by him, offering unwavering encouragement through one of the hardest chapters of his life. And now, with his son on the way, Caleb is creating a family rooted in love and kindness, a family that reflects the best parts of who he has become. Finally, Caleb's story is a testament to the importance of breaking cycles of pain. It's easy to carry the hurt we've experienced into the next chapter of our lives, but Caleb chose a different path. Instead of allowing his father's mistakes to define him, he made a vow to be the kind of parent he never had. That's a profound act of strength and growth, and it's a reminder to all of us that we have the power to change our narrative, no matter where we come from. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Caleb's situation? Would you have told Jennifer the truth, knowing the potential consequences, or would you have stayed silent to avoid disrupting her life? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know your perspective. If you found Caleb's story as powerful as I did, don't forget to give this video a like. Your support helps more people discover stories like this, and it means so much to us here at AGS Stories. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We also have a thriving community over on Discord where we discuss these stories in depth and share our own experiences. Check out the link in the description if you want to join the conversation. Thank you for being here and for taking the time to listen to Caleb's journey. It's stories like his that remind us of the strength of the human spirit and the importance of surrounding ourselves with love and support. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.